It is well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary systems, for if they did, I believe that there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. Henry Ford. Welcome back to Lodestar, where we explore the greatest stories never told. As we concluded episode 3, Clarence Saunders found himself on the razor's edge, locked in a game of chicken, not only with the short sellers he'd trapped in a corner on his company's stock, but with the New York Stock Exchange itself. Because just as he sprang his trap and demanded delivery on all of the shares he'd loaned to the bears within the standard 24-hour repayment period, the governors of the exchange swooped in to freeze trading in Piggly Wiggly stock and stop the clock on Saunders' dreaded deadline. As the entire nation fixed its attention on this brewing Main Street versus Wall Street brawl, Saunders prepared to rip back the curtain and show all the folks, these faceless men who were pulling the strings of the businesses where they shopped and worked every day, control of the world's first self-service supermarket hung in the balance. The winner would take all, and with it the power to influence the future of how the world shops for food. This is Lodestar. Clarence Saunders and the Piggly Wiggly Crisis, Part 4. Street Fighting Man. The evening after his original ultimatum had passed, with everything that he had fought for now at stake, and the entire nation's attention fixed squarely on him, Clarence Saunders went all in, calling the governor's bluff and demanding satisfaction. Saunders assembled a raucous crowd of reporters to issue his first public statement on the crisis.
Mr. Saunders.
Okay.
What do you think?
A razor to my throat, figuratively speaking, is why I suddenly and without warning kicked the pegs out from under Wall Street and its gang of gamblers and market manipulators. Yeah. It was strictly a question of whether I should survive, and likewise my business and the fortunes of my friends, or whether I should be licked and pointed to as a boob from Tennessee, and the supposedly invulnerable Wall Street powers found their methods controverted by well-laid plans and quick action. Saunders wound up his statement stating that he expected all debts that he was owed to be repaid within the standard 24-hour deadline, and that he didn't recognize the exchange's new deadline extension. Although Piggly Wiggly had hit an all-time high at 124 the previous day, Saunders restated his demand for settlement in full by 3 p.m. tomorrow, Thursday, at $150 a share.
Yeah, that's right. Give him hell, Clarence.
Yeah.
Whoop him good.
Yeah, and after that, my price will be $250.
Get him, Clarence.
Saunders was riding high, and with his corner now complete, could have demanded whatever price popped into his head. So he seemed to feel that $250 a share was a fair price for all the pain and suffering the bears had put him through. At that moment, much of the country was rooting for him, and Saunders remained confident that with the facts on his side, however the game would play out, he'd drawn a very tough hand to beat. On paper, he was sitting on an enormous personal windfall. When asked about how much he'd made on the deal, Saunders grinned and declined to guess, but estimates ranging around $10 million were suggested. This would equal nearly $180 million in 2024 dollars. And even at a price of $82 where the stock had been frozen, he'd have plenty of money to repay his backers and make out with a king's ransom, and whatever else he could still squeeze out of the desperate short sellers would be icing on the cake. In local newspapers, editorials gushed. There's a bunch of smart gentry away out on a wobbling limb, with Clarence Saunders of Memphis, Tennessee, sawing away at said limb, and it's a pathetic picture. Another paper added, few of us lack a bit of the old homestead slant of life that makes us grin. whenever the Yap puts it all over on the city slicker. The New York Times had quite a different view of the matter, stating that the performance of a stock chain store supply enterprise with the extremely dignified title of Piggly Wiggly was a humiliation to the stock exchange because of the relative unimportance of the enterprise concerned. No doubt we shall hear appeals to the public of the high-handed methods of the exchange's governing committee. There are times, however, when prompt action of this sort is the only safeguard which the market and the public can have against the reckless misuse of opportunities by manipulators and thimble riggers. Furious at Saunders' public statements that he intended to ignore their orders and proceed with his demands for repayment under the New York Stock Exchange's normal rules, the governors summoned Saunders to explain himself. An attorney representing Saunders appeared before the exchange's law committee and requested that the trading freeze on Piggly Wiggly be lifted. When asked about Saunders' latest demands for repayment, he said that $150 was the minimum amount that Mr. Saunders would accept. When they asked him why, he stated, "It was a reasonable figure in view of the fact that Mr. Saunders has them in a trap." By ignoring the exchange's deadline and announcing his own ultimatum, Saunders had poked the governors right in the eye, and so they decided to knock the pegs out from under him and be done with this nuisance once and for all. By late Thursday, to Saunders' surprise, very few of the short sellers had come forward to settle up, perhaps because they had caught rumors that the winds were about to shift back in their favor. But now Saunders, beginning to realize the fix that he was in, struck back with an immediate statement. "If a bank were unable to meet its clearings, all of us know what would happen to that kind of bank. The bank examiner would have a sign stuck up on the door with the word 'closed.' It is unbelievable to me that the august and all-powerful New York Stock Exchange is a welcher. Therefore, I continue to believe that the shares of stock still due to me on contracts will be settled on the proper basis." An editorial in the Memphis Commercial Appeal backed up Saunders' cry of treachery, declaring, "This looks like what gamblers call welching, and we hope that the homeboy beats 'em to a frazzle." That same day, Piggly Wiggly released a glowing financial report showing that the company was in fantastic shape by all measures. But by now, Saunders had realized that the real value of the company was irrelevant, and that the only thing that mattered was the game. With the clock ticking on that Friday morning, Saunders flinched. In a surprising reversal, Saunders backtracked from his original demand of $250 and suddenly announced that, out of the generosity of his heart, he'd now accept a cool $100 and let bygones be bygones. But what could have spurred such an uncharacteristic about-face? Saunders had become alarmed by a sudden surge of unexpected correspondences that were beginning to arrive from strange locales. The fix is in. By slowing the clock, the lifeline the exchange had given to the bears had provided them with 2 precious days to scan the lists of Piggly Wiggly stockholders and scavenge the heartland for available shares. Benevolent strangers calling long distance rang up the widows and orphans of Peoria to give them the incredible news that they wanted to buy their stock for $100. Besides, the friendly voices no doubt also explained that since the stock was now frozen due to this or that technicality, that this might be their last chance to sell. And having no knowledge of the brawl tearing Wall Street apart at the seams, many of these grateful citizens replied that, Why yes, we'd be pleased to dig into the mattress and fish them out," for at least double what they had bought them for only months earlier. The kindly New Yorkers then requested that they send their certificates courier express to Mr. Clarence Saunders in Memphis, Tennessee. Saunders' stock bubble had suddenly burst. Only 2 days earlier, the bears had thought that they were roadkill, but by Friday night, through either finding these over-the-counter deals or by taking Saunders up on his once-in-a-lifetime $100 keep-me-out-of-jail deal of the century. Nearly all of the short sellers had slipped from Saunders' $250 trap and were in the clear. At the time, there were about 42,000 shares still held by the short interests, and whoever they were, they stood to lose millions. The share of money the bears would have had to repay Saunders would have been worth more than $100 million in 2024 dollars. Furious at being had, Saunders fired off a statement that Friday night, aimed directly at the heart of his new target. Wall Street got licked and then called for mama. Of all of the institutions in America, the New York Stock Exchange is the worst menace of all, in its power to ruin all who dare oppose it. An association of men who claim the right that no king or autocrat ever dared to take, to make a rule that applies one day and then abrogate it the next, to let out a bunch of welchers. My whole life, from this day on, will be aimed towards protecting the public from a like occurrence. I am not afraid. Let Wall Street get me, if they can. Saunders concluded his statement by announcing that he was filing a lawsuit against the New York Stock Exchange. His investors would also file a separate suit against the exchange later that year. Damage control. The following Monday, after the close of trading, when their second ad hoc deadline had safely passed, perhaps attempting to deflect some of the heat from Saunders' daily public tirades, which were mounting towards a public relations disaster, the exchange's governors offered a weak explanation for their unprecedented actions. They claimed that they were well within their rights to halt Piggly Wiggly's trading under the rules of the exchange's constitution, and they were justified to do so to prevent collateral harm to the public. The demoralizing effects of such a situation are not limited to those directly affected by these contracts, but extends to the whole market. The governors did have some justification for this statement. Whenever a big stock corner has been achieved, there were three major potential risks that could occur, all of which could spell disaster for the market, which the governors were charged to protect. First, that those trapped in a squeeze would often start to sell off good stocks in other companies that they owned in their rush to avoid prison, and the falling prices that resulted could set off a general panic. The second risk was that the short sellers could just declare bankruptcy and refuse to pay back their bankers, setting off a chain reaction among the major financial houses, the kind of reaction that in recent years we've come to know as too big to fail. And as if either of those risks weren't enough to keep them awake at night, the third risk, which the governors specifically pointed out, was that an earlier unchecked corner had spread fear of rampant manipulations and spooked the confidence of the public, and all of the folks scrambling for the exits had depressed the overall stock market for some time. Regardless of which risk might occur, either a big sell-off causing a panic, bankruptcy bumper cars leading to a full-blown banking crisis, or a shark attack nasty enough to scare the folks away from the beach for a few years. Whenever the public gets burned so bad that they turn their backs on the market entirely, it can take an entire generation for their confidence to return. And this was the scariest possible scenario for the governors, whose only job was to protect that confidence. But while all these risks that a corner could potentially pose were indeed valid, it didn't change the fact that a corner itself wasn't illegal or against any rules. And while Saunders may have gotten extremely creative with the rules of the exchange, it wasn't really clear if he had broken any of them. But the governor's action to freeze trading in Piggly Wiggly was viewed with suspicion by the public, and their decision to extend the short seller's deadline almost certainly violated the existing rules under the exchange's constitution. On the first point, the governors pronounced that their rules said that they could suspend the stock's trading, and so their decision to do so was therefore irreproachable. This is the equivalent of ending an argument against a bratty child with a good old-fashioned "because I said so." On the second point, of whether they had authority to arbitrarily extend a repayment deadline, they dodged. In a later court case, Exchange President Seymour Cromwell argued that because Saunders had violated earlier agreements, the governors were within their rights to suspend their own rules and make the deadline whatever length of time they said it should be. In other words, since Saunders had outfoxed them, they had no choice but to pull the fire alarm. 2 years later, after the storm had safely passed, the governors went back and quietly amended their rules to retroactively grant themselves the power to do exactly what they had done and change repayment deadlines with the wave of a hand. This action not only represented an admission of guilt on the part of the exchange, but would also give the governors a trump card to warn off anyone in the future who would be foolish enough to try and follow in Saunders' example. And after all the grief that Saunders would cause them, the governors would see to it that his was the last great corner. Give me shelter. By the time of our story, it was already well known that in a few famous corners leading up to the Piggly crisis, several exchange governors had themselves been personally involved in the short selling and neck deep on the losing side had used their influence to shut things down and save their own bacon. So by 1923, the public held a healthy distrust of the institutions governing the stock market. A series of similar incidents dating back decades had stoked widespread loathing of the predatory short sellers who had often left behind a trail of wrecked companies and ruined fortunes as they'd slipped away. Whoever these bears were who had just attacked Piggly Wiggly, they seemed very well connected, but they probably never expected such a blistering counterattack by the company's boss, or could have imagined how quickly things escalated into one of the most dramatic events of the whole era. But with the exchange's help, they'd narrowly avoided disaster. For now. So was Saunders now screaming to the entire world that he'd been cheated, and claiming that the whole game was rigged? It was anyone's guess what he might try next. And so, they needed to lay low for a while, and pray that their friends could keep this madman at bay until his steamroller ran out of gas. The Inside Men. In the case of the Piggly crisis, two key committees among the Board of Governors stood at the scene of the crime. There was the 5-man Business Conduct Committee and the 4-man Law Committee. It's impossible to determine all of the personal holdings of the members of these committees who planned the crackdown on Piggly Wiggly, but among this cast of characters, at least one of them would soon be on his way to prison for fraud and financial crimes that would make Bernie Madoff blush. So, there were these 8 key governors who decided Piggly Wiggly's fate. But hold on, if there were 5 men on the Conduct Committee and 4 on the Law Committee, shouldn't that equal 9? The number was in fact 8, because the chairman of the Business Conduct Committee was Winthrop Burr. Winthrop Burr also sat on the Law Committee, so he was a kind of super governor, because he was the only member at the time who sat on both of the key committees that sealed Piggly Wiggly's fate. And so Winthrop Burr's vote counted twice. So who exactly was Mr. Burr? Winthrop Burr was a descendant of Aaron Burr, of Alexander Hamilton fame, and was a pretty big deal on Wall Street in those days. But Winthrop Burr didn't let his responsibilities as a boss of the exchange interfere with his day job as a broker-dealer. And in the months leading up to the Bear raid on Piggly Wiggly, Winthrop Burr's private brokerage firm was cooking up some pretty interesting deals with some pretty shady operators out of Boston. We'll delve into the details of which a bit later, but for the time being, just keep old Mr. Burr's name on the list of potential insiders. There was also Richard Whitney, who was a member on the all-important Business Conduct Committee. At that time, Whitney, who had spent his entire career at the storied firm of J.P. Morgan and was still an active broker there, was quite influential. In a few years, Richard Whitney would become the president of the New York Stock Exchange and be an outspoken defender of the exchange's unchecked authority, fending off all interference from politicians and the public with tooth and nail. He even went so far as to ignore the pleadings of President Calvin Coolidge when he begged Whitney to rein in the short-selling and speculative orgy in the chaotic months leading up to the great crash of 1929, brushing aside the president's concerns as if there's nothing to see here. During the famed Pecora hearings held by the U.S. Senate that would later expose the worst excesses of 1920s Wall Street, by then, Exchange President Richard Whitney refused to produce a list naming the top 2,000 short sellers demanded by senators and was grilled by the committee as a hostile witness. The Whitney brothers were descendants of Eli Whitney, the inventor of the cotton gin, and they were about as close to Wall Street royalty as you could get. Richard Whitney served as the treasurer of the New York City Yacht Club, and his brother George Whitney, anointed to become the next CEO at J.P. Morgan, was married to the daughter of a U.S. Secretary of State. At the time of the Piggly crisis, the Whitney brothers were both riding high, but several years down the road, in 1938, Mr. Richard Whitney would be on his way to the Sing Sing Penitentiary for a plethora of financial crimes. But Richard Whitney had a lifestyle to maintain and just couldn't manage to finance it the old-fashioned way. So it's not impossible to imagine that he and his family's banking connections may have had something to do with the bear operation trying to wreck Piggly Wiggly. Richard Whitney was presumed to be a brilliant financier, but following a series of bad bets in an Apple hooch called Jersey Lightning just before the repeal of Prohibition, to hide his losses and maintain his lavish lifestyle, he proceeded to embezzle every pile of cash that he could get his hands on, raiding funds from the New York Yacht Club, his dead father-in-law's estate, and even from the New York Stock Exchange itself. In total, Richard Whitney stole more than $1.25 million, or more than $23 million in 2024 dollars, disgracing his family's name and derailing his brother's meteoric career. As we earlier noted, previous attempts at corners that the exchange had shut down had later revealed double dealing by some of the governors who had been caught on the bear side and used their influence to escape the consequences. So the heavy-handedness employed against Piggly Wiggly played into Saunders' claims of cheating, and he was now threatening to expose the entire system as crooked. And so, regardless of who the inside man may have been that was orchestrating the crackdown on Saunders' company, the governors quickly decided to lock arms and shut him down for good. These were the kind of people who ran the game in the boom years of 1920s America, the inner circle around whom the entire system of American business orbited. Their families and interests made up the boards of blue-chip companies that reached into every industry, as well as the major banks that backed them. In those wild and woolly days before the creation of the SEC, Wall Street had no policemen, and there was nobody watching the watchers of this small private club, running their gentleman's game and tilting the tables against an unwelcome outsider. The New York Times seemed to speak for the group, writing, "Bad news for a nation at least 66 2/3% sucker, which had its moment of triumph when it read that a sucker had his foot on Wall Street's neck while the vicious manipulators gasped their lives away. Saunders waved his sword and thumped his shield and went back to Memphis to tell the folks about it. And Wicked Wall Street was up at the count of 9 with its winds fresh and ready for another round. Saunders must have smirked reading this, as he thought to himself, game on. He was becoming a folk hero and enjoyed broad public support, especially among his hometown crowd back in Memphis. So Saunders called a press conference announcing, "It would be a disgrace to have my stocks handled anywhere about Wall Street, so I will sell directly to the people." He renewed his offer to sell the stock directly to the folks at the old magic price of $55 a share, and Saunders kicked off a national newspaper campaign to drum up support. But the Wall Streeters threw cold water on this plan by spreading the word through their banking connections not to buy the stock, and that it wasn't worth $55 a share. The public got spooked by these warnings, and his campaign quickly fizzled. It was becoming apparent that Saunders would have to get more creative if he hoped to convert this mountain of stock into cash. But Clarence Saunders was a man on a mission. All of his crazy ideas had actually worked and launched him from a nobody to headline news in the paper of record. He was the Henry Ford of retail sales and had just revolutionized the way that people shop for food in America. His Piggly Wiggly system had taken the country by storm, and by franchising this model, had converted small-town mom-and-pop grocery stores into Piggly Wigglies from coast to coast. And he had just started expanding into Canada and Mexico. And it must have seemed that if he could just find a way through all of this, that Piggly Wiggly could conquer the world. But now Saunders was in real trouble. He owed nearly $10 million to his Southern banker friends who had backed him. Between his $100 fire sale and the mail-order layaway scheme, he'd raked in enough to pay back about half of what he owed. His investors weren't calling for his head just yet, but they also made it clear that they couldn't wait for his lawsuit against the exchange to play out, so the clock was ticking on him. He needed another $5 million, 2.5 by September, and the rest by Christmas. Saunders had invested his entire personal fortune and reputation defending his dream, and it may have finally begun to dawn on him that if he couldn't find a way out of this mess, then he could not only be facing personal bankruptcy, but he might actually lose control of the company itself. The exchange's unprecedented actions to stop Saunders marked one of the most dramatic turning points of the Roaring Twenties and would spell the beginning of the end for this renegade grocer and his revolutionary company. By freezing the trading in Piggly Wiggly stock and cutting off Saunders' access to the market, the governors of the exchange had saddled him with a ton of overpriced stock that's true value was as hard to determine as exactly where he could even sell it all. In a single stroke, the governors had not only pulled the shadowy syndicate of bears out from the jaws of Saunders' terrible trap, but had pushed him directly into their place. And in true Bond-villain fashion, these powers now seemed intent to sit back and watch his creditors circle in and finish him off for good. And so now, at long last, it finally begs the question, who killed Piggly Wiggly? So just exactly who were these bear raiders orchestrating the attack against Piggly Wiggly? Who had the most to gain by crushing this upstart? Who had the motive, means, and opportunity to take Saunders' company down? And perhaps most importantly, who benefited? For nearly 100 years, the identities of the bear raiders who shattered the world's first supermarket were never revealed. But in our next episode, for the first time ever, we will unmask them. We've found a few clues already. Remember Winthrop Burr, our possible inside man on the exchange? Details of Burr's personal finances are sparse, but his firm Parkinson & Burr, of Boston, Massachusetts, participated in several municipal bond syndicates in late 1922, just before and during the raid on Piggly Wiggly. Burr's firm was not active in the municipal bond market at that time, So a deal that they joined right at the onset of the Piggly crisis seems to stand out. A deal that also involved an up-and-coming stock operator and political wheeler-dealer from Boston by the name of Joseph Kennedy. Little is known about Joseph Kennedy's dealings around this time, but he was already on his way to creating one of America's most spectacular family fortunes. Could it be possible that some of that wealth came from the destruction of Piggly Wiggly? It's hard to say for sure, but whoever engineered the attack on Piggly Wiggly must have had some excellent connections, and a Boston banker sitting on both of the key committees would be an excellent friend to have in a pinch. So don't forget about old Joe Kennedy. We'll get to him soon enough. But there were plenty of other ways that one could profit from a company in such distress, and all of Piggly Wiggly's patents were like a press for printing money. So who else might have been waiting to pick apart these pieces of the shattered pig? If you've ever shopped for food at a Kroger or Safeway store, you might be closer to the answer than you ever would have guessed. Saunders needed fast cash and wasn't about to surrender. He began to sell off some of Piggly Wiggly's stores to buy time, but he still had to find a way to sell off this ton of stock to save his company. And so he got to work hatching a new plan. Saunders still had a few tricks up his sleeve, but with his creditors closing in, and his access to the exchange cutting him off from the most obvious place to sell his shares, the lords of Wall Street seemed intent to sit back and watch him twist in the wind, making it clear to all that there's just no place for a street-fighting man.
You want to be my man, you got to give me $40 down. You want to be my man, you got to give me $40 down. Don't be my man, your baby's going to leave this town. Well, Mr. Crump don't allow no easy riders, yeah. Mr. Crump don't allow no easy riders, yeah. We don't care what Mr. Crump don't allow. We go to the bell house anyhow. Mr. Crump won't allow it. Ain't gonna have